They told you the story was an accident. They told you she drowned at sea, that her body was lost to the tides, that her death was a tragedy best forgotten. But listen closely, because what you're about to hear was never meant to reach you. On an August night in 1893, a single scream cut through the Newport air, a sound swallowed by the ocean, silenced by the walls of marble mansions, and buried under a century of lies. The scream belonged to Evangeline Cunningham, the heiress of a fortune worth more than $40 million. By morning, she was gone. No body, no witness, just an emptiness where a young woman once stood and the artifacts she left behind, artifacts that whispered of a conspiracy so vast it made murder look like a business expense. In her locked chamber, investigators found things they could not explain. A leather-bound journal filled with names of America's most powerful men, each tethered to numbers that weren't accounts but debts paid in silence, in disappearances, in blood. Photographs of Newport's elite families marked with occult symbols, as if someone had already judged them guilty. Forged death certificates, carbon copies of one another, detailing deaths by accident, that all bore the unmistakable signature of arsenic. And yet, what happened next was not an investigation. It was an erasure. Judges issued orders before evidence could be reviewed. Reporters who dared to question the narrative found themselves visited by polite men in tailored suits, the kind who smiled while reminding you that widows and orphans sometimes suffer terrible accidents too. The official story? Evangeline Cunningham died abroad. A tragic misfortune. Nothing to see. Move along. But if that were true, why did federal investigators find their access blocked at every turn? Why did witnesses vanish before they could testify? Why, even now, does the Cunningham family insist that Evangeline's body was peacefully buried, in a grave that has never been opened? You see, this is not just a story of one woman's disappearance. This is about the machine that made her vanish, a compact of wealth and power that shaped America itself. The same forces that engineered depressions, bought presidents, silenced journalists, and carved the nation into a private empire. Evangeline didn't simply vanish. She was erased because she had seen too much, because she had asked the one question no one in Newport dared to ask. Who really owns this country? Newport, Rhode Island, the playground of America's aristocracy. Marble palaces rising from the cliffs like fortresses of excess. Each summer cottage costing more lives to build than its owners would ever admit. To the outside world, this was elegance, refinement, the peak of civilization. But to those who watched closely, Newport was something else entirely. A stage where the richest men in America rehearsed their dominance, where the theater of luxury disguised a deeper truth that wealth had become a weapon and society itself was the battlefield. By the 1890s, America's so-called Gilded Age was more than glitter. It was camouflage. Behind the satin gowns and champagne galas, families like the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the Cunninghams were not competing for beauty or taste. They were dividing spoils. Railroads, steel, coal, timber. Shipping, each family claimed its domain like medieval barons, guarded not by knights but by corrupt judges, bribed senators, and private armies of hired detectives. And Newport was their fortress, a walled garden where they could plot without consequence. Evangeline Cunningham grew up inside this fortress. She was meant to be ornamental, a daughter polished like glass, then married off to secure alliances that would tighten the chains of wealth. But Evangeline was not ornamental. She was dangerous. She read the ledgers. She studied the contracts. She discovered that beneath every great fortune lay an ossuary of the forgotten immigrants buried under scaffolds, miners sealed in collapsed tunnels, laborers consumed by arsenic fumes in factories that were never inspected. She saw the bones beneath the gold, and it terrified them, not because she knew, but because she was willing to ask the forbidden questions out loud. What did the Newport Compact really plan when they gathered in their candlelit rooms, shutting the doors to servants and wives alike? Why were their coded signals carved into the stone of their estate's emblems that mirrored the symbols Evangeline had marked across her photographs? Why did accidents always befall those who threatened lawsuits, or whispered to reporters, or dared to challenge the hidden monopoly of America's empire builders? The summer of 1893 was not simply another season of excess. It was a season of fear. Evangeline's father was dying. His empire trembled. And she, the only heir, was circling too close to the truth. The compact could not allow her to inherit without control. They needed her silenced. They needed her bent to their will. But when she resisted, when she began compiling her evidence, when she dared to imagine escape from their gilded prison, her disappearance became inevitable. And here lies the question that cuts deeper than her vanishing. Was Evangeline the victim of one conspiracy or the spark that nearly exposed an empire of them? You must understand something. Newport was not just a summer retreat. It was a laboratory of control. Every marble staircase, every chandelier, every gala ball was more than excess, it was strategy. The elite gathered not simply to display wealth but to rehearse power. Here, in rooms closed to the public, they perfected what I call the psychology of submission. They knew that ruling a nation required more than railroads and factories. It required controlling perception, bending minds until obedience felt like choice. Think about the newspapers. In 1893, most Americans learned of the world through ink pressed by men who answered to advertisers. And who bought those advertisements? The same industrialists whose fortunes Evangeline was tracing. A single phone call, a quiet visit, a promised advertisement withdrawn, and stories vanished before they ever reached the public eye. This is why the accounts of Evangeline's disappearance were contradictory, muddled, and quickly replaced with gossip columns about fashion and balls. Information itself had been turned into a weapon. But their system went deeper. The Newport Compact had mastered something far older than journalism. They knew the value of ritual. Every gala was a ceremony designed to enforce hierarchy. Who entered first, who danced with whom, whose glass was filled before another's. These were not trivial gestures. They were rehearsals of dominance. Guests absorbed the unspoken message. You belong here or you do not. And those who did not belong never lasted long in Newport. Evangeline disrupted these rituals. She asked questions at dinners that froze the room. She demanded explanations for fortunes built on bodies. She carried her leather-bound journal like a weapon, filling it not with poetry, but with ledgers and symbols that mapped the web of hidden influence. Imagine the terror she inspired in men twice her age, men who had killed with signatures and silenced rivals with checks. A young woman unafraid, unbought, unbroken, holding their empire under a magnifying glass. And here's the part they'll never admit. Evangeline wasn't alone. Letters discovered a century later suggest she was corresponding with federal agents, journalists, even foreign financiers who recognized the compact for what it was: not business, but organized crime at the highest level. They called it the American conspiracy. And if her notes are to be believed, she was preparing to expose it in the only way possible, by making the story too large to bury. That is why she had to vanish. Not because she was weak, not because she stumbled into danger, but because she threatened to reveal the hidden machinery that still hums beneath our world today. The night she vanished was staged with precision. Do not imagine chaos. Do not picture a desperate scramble. Know what unfolded inside Windward Hall was closer to a ritual, orchestrated step by step, as if rehearsed long before Evangeline ever entered the ballroom. The orchestra played louder than usual that night, drowning out anything that might have been heard in the corridors above. Guests were distracted with rare wines uncorked earlier than planned, while servants were quietly rotated, the usual staff sent home, replaced by men who never appeared in Newport again. Witnesses later recalled odd details. A sudden dimming of the gas lamps at precisely 11:07, the unexplained closing of the mansion's north wing doors, and a strange signal, a cluster of 3 sharp knocks echoing through the marble halls. To the untrained eye, these were accidents of the evening. To those who understood Newport's hidden codes, they were signals. The moment had arrived. By midnight, Evangeline was gone. Her suite upstairs stripped of life in under an hour. Personal letters burned in the hearth, but not all. They missed the photographs hidden in her writing desk, the ones marked with occult sigils, as though she had already sensed betrayal approaching. More chilling still, her journal remained. Not the full ledger, she had hidden the original elsewhere, but a decoy filled with enough evidence to suggest the scope of what she knew. And this is where the cover-up began. Within 12 hours, telegrams were dispatched to Washington, urging restraint, citing family grief and matters of privacy. Judges issued sealed orders, blocking federal inspection of the Cunningham estate. Newspapers that dared to print rumors about foul play were threatened with financial ruin. A reporter from the Providence Journal who pressed the matter was found 3 days later in a boarding house. Throat cut, officially ruled suicide. And then came the narrative. Carefully scripted, repeated word for word. Evangeline had left Newport for Europe. She had taken ill abroad. She had died suddenly, peacefully. No witnesses, no body, no details. Just silence. The more questions were asked, the more uniform the answers became. And when people began to whisper of inconsistencies, men in black carriages arrived at their doors with offers, or with warnings. This is how you manufacture history, not by telling the truth, but by erasing alternatives until only one version remains. Evangeline Cunningham did not vanish into thin air. She was disappeared. And the men who erased her left behind a chilling blueprint, a method of control that still governs how narratives are shaped today. The traces of truth they failed to destroy are like cracks in marble faint, but impossible to erase. What the compact didn't count on was that Evangeline had hidden her work in layers, scattering fragments of her discovery like breadcrumbs meant for someone who might come after her. And those fragments tell us more about Newport's Gilded Stage than the official record ever dared. First, the forged death certificates. 3 separate coroners, 3 different towns, yet every certificate bore the same signature stroke, the same clumsy replication of a flourish. The deaths they certified were called accidents, drownings, falls, illnesses, but each body had shown the same signs. Violent vomiting, convulsions, blackened fingernails, arsenic poisoning. This wasn't random tragedy. It was industrial execution. Evangeline's notes suggested that these men were whistleblowers, lawyers, and in one case, a priest who had heard too much in confession. They weren't accidents. They were eliminations. Second, the tunnels beneath Newport's estates. On the surface, they looked like eccentric indulgences, underground wine cellars, passageways connecting gardens. But records uncovered in the 1970s show that many of these tunnels led not just between mansions, but to hidden docks along the coast, smuggling routes, escape routes, and in one chilling instance, a tunnel beneath Windward Hall led directly to a sealed chamber, a chamber filled with filing cabinets, destroyed by fire sometime in late August 1893. Third, the compact itself. They called it the Newport Compact, though it was never written, never signed, only spoken behind locked doors. Families swore loyalty through silence. They divided industries like feudal baronies, agreeing not to encroach on each other's monopolies. And they enforced obedience through fear, not fear of ruin, but fear of death. Evangeline's journal named at least 37 individuals whose lives ended abruptly after crossing the compact. The pattern is undeniable. Each one stood at the threshold of exposure, each one silenced before their story could spread. What makes this more than history is the mechanism behind it. You see, the compact understood that truth is fragile. It doesn't need to be disproven, only drowned. They buried inconvenient stories beneath noise scandals about parties, divorces, the latest gowns from Paris. They fed the public distractions while quietly erasing those who resisted. Newport was the test site. America was the laboratory. And Evangeline Cunningham, at just 23 years old, had pierced the veil. She knew that wealth was not just inherited, but weaponized. She knew that America's brightest jewels were mined from coffins. And because she refused to look away, she was marked, not as a victim, but as a threat. The year was 1893, and the nation was burning with fear. Banks collapsed, railroads shuttered, thousands of men thrown into the streets overnight. They called it a panic, the Panic of 1893, as if it were some natural storm, an accident of the economy. But Evangeline's notes, and the letters uncovered decades later, point to something darker. The collapse wasn't an accident. It was engineered. The Newport Compact had learned a brutal truth. Financial chaos is the most efficient weapon of control. By tightening credit, by deliberately withdrawing capital, by allowing select companies to fall like dominoes, they created a chain reaction that crushed their rivals. Small businesses evaporated. Competing railroads were swallowed whole for pennies on the dollar. Newspapers that dared to question the narrative suddenly faced bankruptcy, their presses silent, all while the compact's fortune swelled, hidden in European accounts immune to the devastation they unleashed at home. And here's where Evangeline comes back into focus. She had traced the money trails, lines of credit flowing from New York banks into foreign vaults, just before the collapse. She suspected correctly that the panic wasn't a market failure, but a purge. It was the compact's way of consolidating power, clearing the board of anyone too weak, too independent, or too curious. And she saw her own family's fingerprints all over it. Imagine what it meant for her to realize this. To understand that her father's fortune, the marble halls she walked, the gown she wore was built not just on sweat and death, but on orchestrated ruin. To know that the compact could devastate entire regions just to keep their grip firm. And worse, that she was expected to marry into this machine, to tie her life to men who profited from suffering as though it were mere strategy. Her resistance made her dangerous. Her knowledge made her lethal. If she lived, if she spoke, if she revealed that America's greatest financial catastrophe was planned, the compact would collapse under its own exposure. That could not be allowed. So when Newport glittered that summer, when galas filled the air with laughter and champagne, beneath it all lay desperation. The compact was bleeding rivals dry, masking murder with economics. And Evangeline was their loose thread, one that, if pulled, could unravel the entire tapestry. History records the Panic of 1893 as a financial accident. Evangeline Cunningham's disappearance suggests it was something far more sinister, the first great rehearsal of systemic economic control, a pattern that would echo again and again into the future. To understand why Evangeline Cunningham vanished, you must first understand who she truly was. She was not the fragile heiress they painted in the society pages, nor the naive debutante her family wished the world to believe. She was something infinitely more dangerous, a woman who could not be bought, educated beyond the limits of her cage, and unafraid to confront the very architects of power. After 3 years in Europe, she returned to Newport transformed. She had studied at finishing schools, yes, but she had slipped beyond the curriculum. She devoured philosophy at the Sorbonne, debated law with tutors who assumed she would never use it, and mastered accounting with a clarity that let her dissect the ledgers of empire like a surgeon's scalpel. She spoke 4 languages fluently: French, Italian, German, and Latin, and could trace business dealings across continents with the precision of a banker. But the most dangerous quality Evangeline possessed was not intellect. It was audacity. She looked at the compact's inner circle, men who had orchestrated wars of labor, who had erased rivals with bribes and poison, and saw not untouchable titans, but fallible men hiding behind ritual and secrecy. She understood that power sustained itself through the illusion of inevitability, and she refused to kneel before it. Her parents had other plans. They paraded suitors before her. European counts with bloodlines but empty coffers, sons of steel magnates with fortunes built on collapsed minds and charred bodies. Each was carefully selected, not for compatibility, but for allegiance. A marriage wasn't romance. It was merger. An heir wasn't family. It was collateral. But Evangeline rejected them all. Not in whispers, not in polite excuses, but openly, publicly, with questions sharp enough to draw blood. What they could not grasp was that she was already building alliances of her own. Letters hidden in the walls of a demolished mansion decades later revealed her correspondences with journalists, private detectives, even federal agents who had begun probing what they called the American conspiracy. She wasn't a lone heiress fumbling in the dark. She was part of a network, small, fragile, but growing. And her inheritance, $40 million, was leverage that could shatter the compact's monopoly if placed in the right hands. This is why Evangeline's existence was intolerable. She was not a victim waiting for rescue. She was a revolution in motion. And revolutions are not permitted in marble fortresses. They are erased. Newport's glittering halls were more than playgrounds. They were theaters of obedience. Every chandelier, every polished floor, every string quartet was part of a script, a carefully choreographed system designed to remind the world, and their own children, of who held the throne. These were not parties. They were rehearsals of control. When the compact gathered, nothing was accidental.
Seating charts dictated invisible hierarchies.
Who entered a ballroom first told you who ruled. Whose glass was refilled before another's was not hospitality, it was ranking. Even marriages were scripted performances, binding fortunes together like feudal treaties. Behind the lace and perfume was the same primal game played by kings and warlords. Submission disguised as elegance. Evangeline Cunningham saw through it. She knew the rituals were not harmless traditions, but a psychological snare. These families had studied power the way others studied art, not by accident, but by deliberate design. They had learned that control over perception is control over reality. If everyone in the room believed the compact's supremacy was natural, then it was natural. Obedience didn't require chains, only consensus. And consensus was manufactured through repetition, spectacle, and fear of exclusion. But Evangeline refused to bow. She disrupted the pattern. At dinners, she asked the questions no one else dared. Why did construction workers keep disappearing during the building of Bellevue Avenue palaces? Why were there tunnels between estates, and why were they guarded? Why did so many widows receive payouts directly from shell companies linked to the compact? Her words sliced through the silence, stripping away the illusion of harmony. And every time she spoke, she fractured the performance that kept their empire intact. This is why she terrified them more than any rival businessman or journalist. Outsiders could be silenced, bribed, or broken. But Evangeline was inside the fortress, born of its blood, carrying its name. If she exposed the rituals for what they were, a gilded mask for corruption, then the mask itself might shatter. And once the mask breaks, even the most powerful are revealed as ordinary men. The compact relied on secrecy and theater to maintain their dominion. Evangeline understood that their greatest weapon was not money or murder, it was the spell they cast over perception. And once she broke the spell, others would awaken. That could not be allowed. Before they erased her, they tried to break her. This is always the first step of control, not the knife, not the poison, but the mind. The compact knew that a strong will could not be destroyed overnight. It had to be worn down, chipped away, until the victim questioned her own reality. And so they turned their weapons inward, using whispers, shadows, and silence to unmake Evangeline Cunningham from the inside. It began with isolation. Trusted servants were quietly dismissed, replaced with new faces whose loyalty ran elsewhere. Friends stopped calling. Letters she sent were intercepted. Invitations that once flooded her days dried to nothing. In the middle of the most glittering season of Newport's history, she found herself surrounded by silence. Loneliness is not an accident in such circles. It is policy. Then came the staged accidents. A horse startled during a carriage ride. A balcony railing that gave way when she leaned against it. A lamp that mysteriously toppled near her bed. Each incident explained away with charm and coincidence, yet each one calculated to remind her, you are not safe. Even within your father's house, danger waits. And the whispers, always the whispers. Servants murmuring about her hysteria. Doctors quietly summoned to examine her nerves. Suitors told she was unstable. This was the most insidious weapon of all. The war for her reputation. For in Newport, once your mind was declared fragile, every word you spoke could be dismissed as fantasy. And what better way to erase a woman holding dangerous truths than to brand her insane? But Evangeline was not so easily broken. Her journal shows she recognized the pattern, the classic architecture of psychological warfare. She wrote that she felt the presence of two worlds. The one she lived in, and the one they wanted her to believe. Her notes reveal a chilling clarity. They are trying to unmake me, but I see them. This more than anything sealed her fate. For when the weapon of doubt fails, when the target resists the manufactured delusion, there remains only one option. The mask of civility is discarded. The knives are unsheathed, and disappearance becomes the final solution. Evangeline's last days were not a tragic accident. They were a systematic campaign of psychological warfare, designed to destroy her spirit before extinguishing her body. And the methods they used against her in 1893 are still the methods used today: isolation, discrediting, accidents that aren't accidents. The same theater played on different stages. The night of August 15, 1893, was the turning point, the moment when whispers became action, when intimidation gave way to ritual elimination. And if you listen closely to the fragments that remain, you can almost reconstruct the choreography of her disappearance. The gala at Windward Hall was designed as camouflage. More than 300 guests filled the marble ballroom, drowning the estate in music, laughter, and champagne. It was the perfect theater. While the crowd danced, the real work could unfold in the shadows above. At 11:07, as witnesses later testified, the gas lamps flickered and dimmed. The orchestra, curiously, played louder, almost frantic, as if cued to mask something. At that exact moment, the doors to the north wing were quietly barred, cutting off access to Evangeline's private quarters. Inside those quarters, things moved quickly. A decoy servant staff had been installed for the evening men, whose names appear nowhere in Newport's registries afterward. Evangeline was escorted, perhaps coerced, from her room. Some accounts suggest she was seen descending a servant's staircase, flanked by two men in dark suits, her expression pale but composed. Others insist she never left her chamber at all, that the tunnel beneath Windward Hall swallowed her, leading to the sealed chamber later found burned. What we know for certain is this: by midnight she was gone. When guests began to whisper, the compact's machine activated. A story was spun instantly. Evangeline had left the party early, claiming fatigue. The next morning, a second story replaced the first. She had embarked for Europe by private yacht. Days later, the final version was cemented: she had died abroad of sudden illness.
No body, no funeral, no grave.
Just layers of narrative, each one designed to smother the last trace of truth. Those who questioned it paid dearly. A maid who claimed she saw Evangeline struggling in the corridor disappeared before she could testify. A journalist from Boston who pressed too hard was arrested on charges that evaporated once his reputation was destroyed. Even a federal investigator assigned to the case was abruptly transferred to Arizona, where he died in a robbery that left his valuables untouched. And here's the detail that chills most. In Evangeline's abandoned chamber, they left the decoy journal behind. Why? Because the compact wanted it discovered. They wanted investigators to see just enough to understand the danger of pursuing the truth, and just enough to know that silence was the only safe response. It wasn't evidence. It was a warning. The heiress did not simply vanish. She was executed in plain sight, under the mask of society's brightest lights. And every trace of that night was buried under theater, intimidation, and the cold efficiency of those who rule not by law, but by fear. After Evangeline's disappearance, Newport did not mourn. Tightened, the compact moved with the precision of a machine, sealing every fracture, every whisper, every hint that their fortress of illusions had cracked. The city became a stage for the greatest cover-up in Gilded Age history. The first step was narrative consolidation. Within a week, 3 separate obituaries appeared in 3 separate papers, each giving a different story of Evangeline's tragic passing abroad. Typhoid fever in Paris, a fainting spell aboard a yacht near Lisbon, a sudden heart failure in Rome. The contradictions were deliberate, not careless. When stories are multiple, they cancel each other. Doubt becomes fatigue, and fatigue becomes silence. Next came the erasure. Evangeline's name was systematically stripped from society columns. Photographs of her vanished from family portraits, replaced by retouched canvases where her figure had been painted out, her face blurred into shadows. Invitations she had once sent were quietly destroyed, her letters to journalists confiscated. Even her accounts were liquidated, folded into family trusts that vanished into railroads and steel mills. To speak of her in Newport society after 1894 was to invite a sudden change of subject, or worse, a sudden end to one's invitations altogether. But suppression leaves shadows. Servants whispered that the north wing of Windward Hall was sealed indefinitely, its windows bricked over. Guests reported strange renovations in the estate cellars, as if tunnels had been collapsed by fire. and travelers swore that at certain hours of the night, they saw women in white wandering the Newport cliffs, their faces turned not to the sea, but to the mansions above, as if they were not seeking escape, but demanding reckoning. Yet the compact's work was not just about hiding Evangeline. It was about weaponizing her absence. Her erasure became a lesson, a whispered warning passed down to the next generation of heiresses and heirs. Step out of line, and you too will be reduced to a ghost. Her fate became the unspoken law of Newport society, a deterrent sharper than any contract. Even decades later, when Newport's golden age had faded, the silence remained. The few who dared to dig writers, detectives, descendants found their work stalled by sudden accidents, missing records, fires in municipal archives. It was as though Evangeline's story had been wrapped in a curse, one spun not by spirits, but by men who understood that history itself could be rewritten if you controlled the ink. And so her name endures only in fragments. A line in a diary, a blurred photograph, a demolished tunnel, a rumor that refuses to die. For the compact may have erased her from their ledgers, but they could not erase the unease. The absence of Evangeline Cunningham is more haunting than her presence ever was, because everyone in Newport knew that she had not vanished by chance. She had been taken, and in that act, something monstrous had been sealed into the city's bones. The disappearance of Evangeline Cunningham was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was precedent. Once the compact realized they could erase a woman of immense fortune and bloodline without consequence, they understood that no one was untouchable. Newport society did not collapse under the weight of her absence. It adapted, as it always did, by swallowing scandal whole and turning it into silence. But the silence was not passive. It was weaponized, and it became the blueprint for everything that followed. In the decades after 1893, other scandals bore the same fingerprints. A steel heir who attempted to expose bribery in Washington fell from a yacht in calm waters. A shipping magnate's daughter, rumored to be compiling evidence of labor abuses, succumbed to a sudden fever after attending a compact ball. Even into the 1920s, when Prohibition fueled new fortunes, those who threatened the hierarchy of Newport's old guard were dispatched with the same combination of accidents, illness, and sudden disappearances. Evangeline's ghost was the pattern they perfected. Her erasure also influenced psychology itself. Historians now argue that the term female hysteria, so popular among Gilded Age physicians, was not simply medical prejudice, but a tool sharpened by families like the compact. It was as though Evangeline's story had been wrapped in a curse, one spun not by spirits, but by men who understood that history itself could be rewritten if you controlled the ink. And so her name endures only in fragments. A line in a diary, a blurred photograph, a demolished tunnel, a rumor that refuses to die. For the compact may have erased her from their ledgers, but they could not erase the unease. The absence of Evangeline Cunningham is more haunting than her presence ever was, because everyone in Newport knew that she had not vanished by chance. She had been taken, and in that act, something monstrous had been sealed into the city's bones. The disappearance of Evangeline Cunningham was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was precedent. Once the compact realized they could erase a woman of immense fortune and bloodline without consequence, they understood that no one was untouchable. Newport society did not collapse under the weight of her absence. It adapted, as it always did, by swallowing scandal whole and turning it into silence. But the silence was not passive. It was weaponized, and it became the blueprint for everything that followed. In the decades after 1893, other scandals bore the same fingerprints. A steel heir who attempted to expose bribery in Washington fell from a yacht in calm waters. A shipping magnate's daughter, rumored to be compiling evidence of labor abuses, succumbed to a sudden fever after attending a compact ball. Even into the 1920s, when Prohibition fueled new fortunes, those who threatened the hierarchy of Newport's old guard were dispatched with the same combination of accidents, illness, and sudden disappearances. Evangeline's ghost was the pattern they perfected. Her erasure also influenced psychology itself. Historians now argue that the term female hysteria, so popular among Gilded Age physicians, was not simply medical prejudice, but a tool sharpened by families like the compact. To label a woman unstable was to disarm her testimony before she ever spoke. Evangeline was one of its most famous victims, not clinically but narratively. And her story foreshadowed the ways in which power structures would later discredit journalists, activists, and whistleblowers by attacking not their evidence, but their sanity. Even in modern conspiracies, echoes remain. Consider the sudden resignations, the mysterious deaths of CEOs under investigation, the data leaks that vanish into sealed courts. The compact's methods misdirection, manufactured narratives, ritual erasure still thrive. They survive not because they are flawless, but because they are effective enough to make the public doubt itself. Just as in Evangeline's time, the true goal is not merely to eliminate a threat, but to warp perception until the elimination itself seems unworthy of belief. Yet there is something else the compact could never erase: the persistence of Evangeline's ghost in collective memory. Every generation has produced its seekers, historians, novelists, occultists, even descendants of the compact itself who sensed that her absence was more than personal tragedy. It was the creation of a wound in history, a gap that festers precisely because it was so carefully hidden. And wounds that remain hidden often bleed the longest. Evangeline Cunningham did not simply vanish. She became the template, and in that sense, her true legacy was not erased at all, it was multiplied. Every cover-up that followed, every scandal disguised, every whistleblower destroyed in silence carries her shadow. Whether they admit it or not, the compact still speaks her name, not in reverence but in fear. Newport pretends to have forgotten Evangeline Cunningham. Tour guides avoid her name. Newspapers omit her from the long lists of vanished women. But the city itself remembers through the cracks in its marble walls, through the whispers carried on the Atlantic winds that batter the cliffs. You see, some absences leave scars too deep for time to smooth. Evangeline's was one of them. There are stories the locals don't tell outsiders unless you press, unless you prove you're not one of them. The stories say that on nights when the fog swallows Bellevue Avenue, a woman in pale silk walks the cliffs behind the ruins of the old Cunningham estate. Her face is hidden, but her hands are always raised, clutching something invisible, as though she's still holding the ledger that damned her. Others speak of Windward Hall itself, long demolished, but said to reappear in spectral outline during storms, its windows lit from within as if the compact's meetings continue in some parallel shadow of history. And then there are the letters. Yes, letters still discovered even now. In 1979, a construction crew tearing up a foundation in Newport found a tin box sealed with wax. Inside were 3 notes written in a feminine hand, dated July 1893. They contained phrases repeated like incantations. They are watchers. The compact cannot bury the sea. If I vanish, follow the shadows beneath the mansions. Experts authenticated the ink and the paper. The letters were hers. But days before they were to be displayed at Brown University, the box vanished from the archive. No break-in.
No trace.
Simply erased. The same pattern, echoing a century later. Even the compact's descendants, many of whom still hold fortunes rooted in those Gilded Age empires, admit privately that Evangeline's ghost is restless. Some speak of strange dreams passed down through their bloodline. A woman knocking on glass, a girl's voice counting names, an unseen presence sitting at the edge of the bed. The haunting is not confined to one mansion or one artifact. It is systemic, woven into the very fabric of Newport's prosperity. That is what makes her story so dangerous. It is not merely history. It is a haunting of truth itself. Evangeline Cunningham did not die in 1893. She became a question, eternal and unanswerable, echoing through boardrooms, archives, and bedrooms of the powerful. And every time someone dares to ask that question, what really happened? Her presence stirs again. The compact silenced her body, but they failed to silence her shadow. And a shadow once unbound does not vanish. It waits. Do you see it now? Evangeline Cunningham was not merely a woman who disappeared. She was the first crack in a mirror that reflects the true face of power in America. Her vanishing was the rehearsal. The compact understood something that few men even now dare to confront. Control does not require guns in the street or armies at the gates. It requires narrative. It requires owning the story, shaping the silence, turning absence into obedience. Think of how her case was handled. Telegrams intercepted. Court orders signed by judges whose loyalty was already purchased. Newspapers persuaded, then threatened, then silenced. What looks at first glance like chaos was in fact system. And that system, the one born in Newport's marble palaces, became the operating model for every form of manipulation that followed. Corporate monopolies, government cover-ups, financial collapses engineered for consolidation, they all echo the compact strategy. Eliminate the threat, then bury the truth beneath a prettier story. What makes this even darker is that Evangeline's disappearance coincided with the Panic of 1893, an economic collapse deliberately designed to break rivals and concentrate power in the hands of those who already had it. Millions of working men lost their livelihoods. Families starved. Entire towns withered. And yet, in Newport, the balls continued. The champagne flowed. The marble mansions grew taller. The compact was not suffering. They were feeding. Evangeline understood this. That was why she had to be erased. And here is the part you cannot ignore. The same structure still breathes. The tactics refined in that age: psychological control through silence, manipulation of crisis for profit, the use of hidden compacts between families, corporations, and governments are alive right now. Every time a scandal vanishes from headlines overnight, every time a whistleblower is discredited before he can testify, every time an accident erases someone inconvenient, you are seeing the afterimage of Newport. Evangeline is whispering again, if only you have the ears to hear it. The compact didn't simply kill a woman. They built a blueprint for controlling the world you live in. And the terrifying part is this. Once you see the pattern, you can never unsee it. The spell breaks, and you begin to notice the strings that pull the stage around you. That awareness is dangerous, but it is also freedom. The men who erased Evangeline hoped the silence would endure forever. Instead, it became a seed. And once a seed takes root, it waits for the right mind to awaken. You've walked with me through shadows tonight. You've followed Evangeline Cunningham from the gilded halls of Newport into the silence where her name was almost erased. And now you stand at the threshold of understanding what most men spend their entire lives avoiding. That history is not a collection of accidents. It is design. And those who sit atop that design have no interest in your awakening. The compact did not just eliminate Evangeline because she was inconvenient. They eliminated her because she represented the most dangerous force in the world, a mind unwilling to kneel. Think about that. She was 23, but she saw what entire generations of men could not. That power is never content to rule openly. It thrives in the hidden, in the whispered, in the forbidden. She threatened to drag that power into the light. And so they chose darkness. But here is the truth the compact fears most. Silencing her body did not silence her story. That seed of forbidden knowledge survived, buried in letters, in whispers, in the uneasy dreams of her killer's descendants. And tonight, through you, it stirs again. Because once you hear this, once you feel it, you cannot go back to sleep. You begin to recognize the same fingerprints in your own time. The corporate collapses that enrich the few while impoverishing millions. The manufactured narratives that shift blame away from those who profit. The disappearances, the sudden deaths, the stories you're told not to ask questions about. It's the same pattern, the same machine, still feeding, still hiding behind marble walls. And now you have a choice. You can dismiss this as just another story and go back into the comfort of silence. Or you can recognize it for what it is. A mirror held up to your own world. Evangeline's ghost is not simply a haunting of Newport. It is a haunting of every man who senses that the game is rigged, that his life is being siphoned, that his freedom has been quietly stolen. The only question is whether you will look away or whether you will awaken. Because once you awaken, you can never unsee the strings. And once you see the strings, you are no longer a pawn in their game, you are a player. Evangeline's disappearance was meant to be the end of her story. But for you, right now, it can be the beginning of yours. The rabbit hole is open. The shadows are waiting. And now, the question is not what happened to Evangeline Cunningham. The question is what happens to you. You've heard what they tried to bury. You've walked with me through the silence they engineered. Now the question is this. Will you let Evangeline's ghost pass you by? Or will you carry her torch? Write the phrase, "The silence breaks," twice in the comments right now. Not once, twice. That's the mark of someone who refuses to kneel, someone who's stepping out of the illusion. The compact reads silence as obedience. Let's show them we are not silent. Join this brotherhood of men who see the strings, who refuse to be pawns. Subscribe now and enter deeper into the truths they never wanted you to hear. The rabbit hole doesn't end here, this is just where it begins.